The galaxy was dying, though most would not admit it. Stars bled their light into the cold black, burning themselves to embers in silence. Whole systems spun into darkness where once their suns had flared, and the ancient fortresses of the Imperium, built in the pride of centuries, crumbled stone by sacred stone. Over the Cadian gate, that eternal watch upon the yawning madness of the Eye of Terror, the void itself seemed to hold its breath. I will tell you now, before the first words of this tale take root. You are not a stranger to me. We may have never met, but you are here, listening, and that makes you kin in the only way that matters. And I truly mean this. I care for you, and I am grateful you are here. This story will not be a kind one, but it is ours to share. So before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, take your coffee, warm your hands around it, and let's begin. The eye pulsed, the eye watched, the eye waited. Cadia stood. It had stood for 10,000 years, an unyielding bastion between the Imperium and the Rift's eternal storms. From its black stone walls and adamantium bastions, generations of soldiers had been born, trained, and buried. Here, every child learned the use of the laser gun before they learned to write. Here, loyalty was not taught, it was inherited. And yet, for all its iron tradition, Cadia was not immortal. No fortress was. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan knew this truth better than any man under his command. He knew it as he stood upon the viewing platform of Casa Partox's upper bastion, watching the crimson haze spread across the horizon. It was not the haze of dawn. No dawn had ever looked like that. It was the warp bleeding into the sky, staining it with the promise of war. The air tasted of static and iron. Somewhere in the distance, the low hum of void shields sang like a dirge, their frequency subtly changing, a sign the outer bastions were testing their limits. Alaric's hands rested on the blackened rail before him. The metal was cold enough to bite through his gloves, but he barely noticed. His eyes, hard as Cadian steel, were fixed on the horizon, where the spires of the inner casas rose like spears against the bleeding sky. His aide, Captain Seric Vale, stood at his side, young, sharp-eyed, and already marked by the white streak in his dark hair, the result of a warp storm that had torn through the 134th Cadian years before. Vale was loyal, devoted, perhaps too devoted, the kind of man who would follow an order even if it led him into the abyss. "My lord," Vale said quietly, "the High Command requests your presence in the Strategium. They say it is urgent." Vaughan's gaze did not waver from the horizon. "It is always urgent. They say the eye has grown by 7% in the last week." That made him turn. Slowly, his eyes met Vale's, and in them there was no surprise, only the weight of inevitability. 7%, Vaughan repeated, as though tasting the words. "And Terror will send us the same orders it always does. Hold, bleed, die standing." Vale hesitated. It was not the sort of remark that an officer of the Imperium should make aloud, even behind closed doors. But Vaughan had never been a man for the comfortable lie. The halls of the Casa were silent as they made their way to the Strategium. Their boots echoed against the black stone floors, past banners faded by centuries of smoke and dust. Each banner was a grave marker in cloth, the name of a regiment, the date of its annihilation, and the words "Cadia stands," embroidered in thread turned dull by time. The Strategium was a cathedral of war, a vast chamber lit by hololithic projectors, their shifting blue light casting ghost shadows on the walls. Around the central table, officers and tacticians clustered, their eyes moving between the pulsing three-dimensional map of the sector and the towering figure of General Primus Harrick. Harrick's voice was iron on stone. Reports confirm what we feared. A significant warp breach at the edges of the Pericles Belt. We estimate a Chaos fleet numbering no fewer than 200 vessels is in transit. Murmurs rippled through the room. Vale stiffened. Vaughn only folded his arms. Terra has sent new orders, Harrick continued. No retreat. Reinforce the outer bastions with every regiment we can spare. We will hold the gate. Vaughn spoke before he could stop himself. At the cost of every man and woman on this world. Harrick's gaze was sharp. We all knew the price when we were born, Castellan. Yes, Vaughn said, his voice low. But knowing it does not make it worth paying. The silence that followed was heavy. Someone cleared their throat. The holomap shifted, displaying the projected incursion paths of the incoming fleet. Red arcs carved through the void like bleeding wounds. In the quiet, Vaughn felt it. That faint vibration beneath his boots. The fortress was alive in its own way, and it felt the storm coming. He had felt it before, in battles past, and it was always the same. The slow, steady heartbeat of Cadia, bracing itself for another blow. The meeting ended with the usual mix of orders and ritual affirmations of loyalty. The officers left in clusters, murmuring to one another, but Vaughn lingered by the map. Sir, Vale asked. They've already written our epitaph, Vaughn murmured. They just haven't carved it yet. When they stepped back into the night air, the crimson haze had deepened. The eye pulsed again, and for an instant, Vaughn thought he saw something vast move within it, a shadow of impossible size shifting in the depths. A shiver ran through him, and not from the cold. Cadia stood. But for how long? The nights on Cadia were not dark. The warp light from the eye bled across the heavens, like a wound that would never close, tinting every stone, every shadow in shades of crimson and violet. The people of Cadia had never known true night. They slept beneath an eternal twilight, their dreams haunted by the distant rumble of storms older than the Imperium itself. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughn walked alone along the walls of Castra Partox, his breath misting in the cold air. The walls were ancient, built by hands long turned to dust, yet still strong enough to resist the pounding of macro shells and the psychic shrieks of demons. Still, he knew strength had limits. All walls eventually broke, no matter what they were built of. He passed sentries posted at regular intervals. They stood rigid, eyes scanning the warp-stained horizon. Laser guns clutched as though the eye might pour its horrors into the streets at any moment. They saluted as he passed, but their eyes told another story. The exhaustion of soldiers who had never known peace. Only the long vigil. He stopped near the North Bastion, where the wall jutted forward in a jagged spur. From here, he could see the plain stretching away toward the distant outer casas. Somewhere out there, the first trenches of the outer defenses cut deep scars into the soil, manned by regiments who knew they would be the first to die. Footsteps approached. He didn't need to turn to know it was Vale. "You walk too much, my lord," Vale said, coming to stand beside him. "I sleep too little," Vaughn replied. "That makes two of us." They stood in silence for a while, watching the horizon. The faint shimmer of void shield projectors could be seen if you knew how to look for them, like heat haze over distant dunes. Vale broke the silence. "I was 16 when I first stood this post, before the 134th. Before I had white in my hair. You're not old enough for nostalgia," Vaughn said, but his voice lacked the bite of a true rebuke. I remember thinking then that Cadia would stand forever, Vale went on, his eyes fixed on the eye's shifting glow, that nothing could ever break us. But after the belt campaign, I started wondering how long a man can stand before his legs give out, how long a world can hold before the cracks run too deep. Vaughan turned to look at him fully. And what answer did you find? Vale smiled faintly. None that would please the priests. They lapsed into silence again, but Vale's words lingered in Vaughan's mind as they walked back toward the inner casa. The following morning, the strategium was filled with the sour tension of politics. Orders from Terra had arrived, hand-delivered by an officer of the Astra Telepathica, his eyes still bloodshot from the psychic strain of the message relay. The orders were as Vaughan expected. Reinforce the outer bastions, no retreat, no mercy. But this time, there was more, an instruction to reassign several of Cadia's elite regiments to other war zones. It was a death sentence. General Primus Harrick's voice boomed across the chamber. The Emperor calls us to serve his will wherever it is most needed. The 32nd Castrican, the 19th Shock Troop, and the 87th Heavy Armor will depart within the week. The room erupted in protest. Officers slammed fists on tables. Voices rose, curses were spat. Though never in the Emperor's name. Vaughan said nothing. He simply watched the map, its cold glow outlining the slow tightening of the noose around Cadia. When the shouting had died down, he spoke quietly, but with an edge of steel. You strip us of our shield, while the blade is already raised. It is not strategy. It is murder. Careful, Castellan, Harrick growled. Vale, standing behind Vaughan, caught the flicker of movement among the officers, some nodding in agreement, others watching with narrowed eyes. It was dangerous ground. Dissent on Cadia was not unheard of, but it was always whispered, never spoken aloud in council. After the meeting, Vale followed Vaughan into the narrow corridors that led back to the Castellan's chambers. You were right, Vale said when they were alone. They're sending us to die. Vaughan stopped walking. You think I don't know that? I think you do, Vale said carefully. And I think you also know there's no reason we have to follow those orders. The words hung in the air like the scent of ozone before a lightning strike. Vaughan turned slowly. Explain yourself. I mean, exactly what I said, Vale replied, voice low but steady. We have the men, the weapons, the walls. We could hold without Terra's help if we stopped bleeding ourselves dry for their other wars. They see Cadia as a bulwark, not as a world. To them, we're a fortress to be spent, not a people to be saved. And your alternative? Vale's eyes met his, unwavering. We stand for Cadia, only Cadia. It was heresy, it was treason. And yet, as Vaughan stood there, he found he could not summon the righteous fury such words should have inspired. Instead, he felt the weight of them, the possibility of them. The rest of the day passed in a blur of inspections, training reports, and requisition orders. But Vale's suggestion gnawed at him. That night, Vaughan sat alone in his quarters. The dim light from the eye poured through the narrow window slit, bathing the room in crimson. On his desk lay a data slate, its screen still displaying the orders from Terra. His fingers hovered over the command to acknowledge receipt. He thought of the faces of the soldiers he had buried, of the casas reduced to rubble, of the banners in the hall, each one a memory of a regiment that no longer marched. In the distance, thunder rolled, or perhaps it was the first rumble of the enemy guns beyond the void. He pressed his thumb to the slate. Orders acknowledged, the machine intoned. The words were spoken, the duty done. But in his heart, a seed had been planted. Cadia still stood, for now. The storm above the Cadian gate had grown. It was not a storm of wind or rain, but of colours that bled and twisted across the heavens, streaks of green fire, violet lightning, and the sickly gold of dying suns. Every few minutes, the warp light flared brighter than it should, throwing the Khazars into sharp relief, as if Cadia itself had been frozen in the act of holding its breath. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan stood in the command balcony of the eastern bastion, watching the distant lines of the outer trenches through a magnocular visor. Even from here, he could see movement, small, precise shapes in the distance, drills in preparation for the enemy that would one day pour from the eye. Behind him, the chamber murmured with the voices of staff officers and vox operators. Reports flowed in from the outer casas, requests for additional munitions, confirmation of training cycles, minor skirmishes with cultist cells on the periphery. All the familiar rhythms of a garrison that had lived on the edge of war for centuries. But beneath the hum of military discipline, Vaughan sensed it. That same faint fracture he had felt in the strategium days earlier. A difference in tone when orders were given. A hesitation before imperial slogans were spoken. The shift came into sharper focus at midday, when a priority signal arrived from the Western Defensive Command. Vaughan stepped to the Vox table as the image resolved into the stern face of Colonel Thade Joran, commander of the 19th Shock Troop. "My lord," Joran began, "I have received the orders from Terra. They wish the 19th redeployed to the Argolis Crusade. I have no intention of complying." It was not a statement an imperial officer made lightly. "You understand what you are saying, Colonel?" Vaughan replied slowly. "I do," Joran said. His voice was calm, his eyes unblinking. "We were raised to defend Cadia. Our fathers died on these walls. Our sons will stand where we stand. Argolis means nothing to us. The eye is here." Several of the staff officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Hold your position, Colonel," Vaughan said at last, "and keep this discussion between us for now." The transmission ended, leaving the room in a strained silence. It did not last long. One of Harrick's envoys, a hard-eyed captain draped in a crimson sash, stepped forward from the shadows near the door. "Lord Castellan, refusal to obey the direct orders of Terra is treason." Vaughan's gaze flicked to him. "And sending our best troops away from the gate is suicide." The captain stiffened. "I will report this to General Primus Harrick." "You do that," Vaughan said, turning back to the visor. His voice was ice. When the captain had gone, Vale approached quietly. "You're not the only one thinking it anymore," Vale murmured. "Others see it. Others are ready to stand for Cadia first." "I haven't decided what I'm ready to stand for," Vaughan replied. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure it was true. That night, the officers' hall was filled with the low murmur of private conversations. Vaughan did not join them. He preferred the solitude of the north ramparts, where the wind carried the scent of ash from the forges below. The ramparts overlooked the industrial quarter, a maze of manufactoria belching smoke and steam into the cold air. Vale found him there, as he often did. "Word is spreading," Vale said. "Quietly, but it's moving. Joran's refusal has inspired others. 2 more regiments are questioning their orders." Vaughan's jaw tightened. "And how long before Harrick hears of it?" "Harrick already knows," Vale replied. "The question is whether he acts against them now, or waits until the situation forces his hand." "You speak as if you want this fracture to grow," Vaughan said. Vale didn't look away. Maybe I do. Maybe it's the only way Cadia survives. Vaughn turned his gaze back to the distant warp light, the shifting colors reflecting in his eyes. And if Cadia survives by breaking faith with the Imperium, what then? What are we? Vale's voice was quiet, but certain. Alive. The next morning brought more than words. A supply convoy from the inner Casa was ambushed on the East Road, not by Chaos Raiders, but by men wearing the colors of the 43rd Cadian Reserve. The reserves claimed the convoy had been ordered to their sector by Harrick himself. The Eastern Bastion claimed otherwise. Shots were exchanged. 3 dead, 7 wounded. Vaughn heard the report in the strategium, his face carved from stone. The chain of command was fraying, not from the enemy without, but from the cracks within. Vale leaned close as the meeting dissolved into arguments. Every day we wait, the choice will be made for us, either by Harrick or by the enemy. The only question is whether we have the courage to choose first. Vaughn said nothing, but when night fell and the eye bled its light across the walls, he found himself looking out over Cadia's battlements and wondering if Vale was right. The thought unsettled him more than the storm. Cadia still stood, but it was beginning to stand in pieces. The first sign was the silence. For days, the Vox channels along the northern front had been alive with the static chatter of patrols and scouts. Short bursts of confirmation codes, updates on trench lines, calls for supply drops. Now, there was nothing, just an open line hissing faintly, like the breath of something too vast to see. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughn stood in the comms pit, his eyes fixed on the projection of the outer defense perimeter. Sections of the map flickered in and out, their signals failing one by one. "Report," he said. "Outer Trench 6 lost contact at 0400 hours," the Vox officer replied, his voice tight. Trench 7 followed 30 minutes later. No distress calls, no flare codes, nothing. Vale stepped up beside him, arms folded. "They're gone." Vaughn gave him a sharp look. "You don't know that." "I know the eye," Vale said quietly. "When it takes men, it doesn't send back the courtesy of a farewell." Before Vaughn could answer, the first rumble came, so deep it seemed to roll through the very bones of the fortress. The ceiling lights trembled. A moment later, the Auspex screens flared with life, a dozen red sigils blooming on the north edge of the display. "Multiple warp signatures," the Auspex officer called out. "Translation points opening. Emperor preserve us. They're inside the debris field." The Eye of Terror had never been still, but what emerged now was not its usual slow bleed of raiders and cult fleets. This was a spearhead. By midday, the northern sky burned. From the upper ramparts of the eastern bastion, Vaughn watched the first wave descend, jagged, spike-ridden craft streaking through the clouds like shards of the night itself. They moved with a speed and precision that screamed of something more dangerous than mere warbands. "Not Chaos Marines," Vale murmured beside him. "Not entirely. Look at the formation, too disciplined. This is a war host." Vaughn didn't answer. He was already issuing orders into his Vox bead, voice clipped, controlled. "Cassur Tyros, bring your field artillery to Grid 7 and hold the line. Cassur Finric, reinforce the trench junction at North Point. All reserve armor to staging ground 3. The responses came back, but each one carried a faint undercurrent of hesitation. A trace of that growing split between Cadia first and Imperium first. Even now, in the face of an invasion, loyalties were divided. By the time the first shells landed, the city's air was thick with the iron taste of ozone. Chaos artillery was crude, but devastating, their shells shrieking through the upper atmosphere before hammering into the Cadian earth with black fire. One blast tore open the western supply depot in a single thunderclap, sending a mushroom of ash and molten debris into the wind. On the northern walls, the 19th Shock Troop fought like men who knew their homes stood behind them. Their last fire stitched the air in tight, disciplined bursts, cutting down the first wave of traitor infantry scrambling over the trench berms. Vaughn arrived at the front just in time to see the second wave break through the smoke. Warriors in spiked armor, their visors glowing with warp light, they moved with an unnatural speed, cutting down defenders with chainswords that howled like hungry beasts. Vaughn drew his power sword, the weapon's blue edge flaring in the choking air. "Hold this line," he roared, his voice carrying even over the thunder of artillery. "For Cadia!" The men rallied, pushing forward in brutal close combat. Vale was there too, moving like a shadow, his blade flashing in precise arcs. He fought without the bellow of command, but every stroke was lethal. An hour later, the northern gate still held, but barely. The enemy had been driven back for the moment, their dead strewn among the shattered barricades. Vaughn stood among the wreckage, breathing hard. His armor was spattered with gore, his sword's edge still hissing from the heat of combat. Vale stepped up beside him, scanning the horizon. This was just the first test. They'll be back. Vaughn nodded. And when they return, they'll hit everywhere at once. As if summoned by his words, the vox bead in his ear flared with overlapping voices. Calls for aid from the western sector, reports of fighting near the industrial quarter, alarms from the inner casas. Vale's gaze sharpened. Harrick will use this. Vaughn turned. Use what? The chaos, the confusion. If he believes you're holding forces back for Cadia first, he'll strip your command. He'll claim the defense of the gate under his sole authority. And the moment he does, he'll send your best regiments away to die somewhere far from here. Vaughn said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. By nightfall, the fortress smelled of smoke and burnt flesh. The first wave had cost Cadia dearly, not in territory, but in blood. The casualty lists were long, and among the names were officers Vaughn had fought beside for decades. In the command chamber, Harrick's voice came over the high-channel vox, brittle and formal. "Lord Castellan Vaughn, you will dispatch the 19th Shock Troop and the 43rd Reserve to my command for immediate redeployment to the Argolis front. This is a direct order, issued under full Imperial sanction." Vaughn's hands tightened into fists. The 19th had just held the northern wall. The 43rd had bled for the industrial quarter. Sending them away now was madness, or betrayal. Before he could respond, Vale leaned close, his voice low and steady. "Say no." Vaughn met his gaze. "And if that makes me a traitor." Vale's expression was cold. "Then be a traitor Cadia will remember." The Vox channel hissed, waiting for his reply. Outside, the northern sky flared again with the light of incoming fire. Vaughn took a breath, and chose. The eye of terror burned brighter than it had in living memory. For weeks the warp had writhed in unnatural agitation, as if some vast beast were stirring in its sleep. Astropaths across Cadia screamed in their cells, clutching their heads until blood ran from their eyes. Transmission delays stretched from seconds to hours. Some messages never arrived at all. Within the command bastion, the atmosphere was no less strained. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughn stood before the primary hololithic map, its ghostly blue projections jittering with static. The outlines of the Cadian sectors were clear, but the surrounding void, normally charted in imperial red, was broken by seething distortions. General Primus Harrick entered flanked by 2 commissars. His expression was tight, his voice brisk. "We have confirmation from Terra," Harrick announced. "The Argolis Crusade will take precedence over all other deployments. The 19th, 27th, and 43rd Shock Troops are to be redeployed within the week." The statement landed like a hammer blow. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. A few avoided Vaughn's eyes entirely. Colonel Joran's refusal was still unpunished. For now. Vaughn kept his voice level. "And if the eye disgorges a war host while our strength is scattered," Harrick's gaze sharpened, "then we will hold as we always have. With discipline, with unity, with faith in the Emperor's will." Vale, standing behind Vaughn, muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Vaughn to hear, "Faith doesn't stop a bolter round." The comment drew a flicker of amusement from one of the younger captains, quickly suppressed. Vaughn spoke again. "With respect, General, Cadia's entire reason for existence is to stand against the Eye. If we strip its defenders now..." Harrick cut him off with a raised hand. "The High Lords see the larger war. We obey. That is the end of it." For a moment, Vaughn's mind conjured an image. Cadia's walls stripped bare, the green fire of the Eye spilling forth unopposed. The names of the Khazars burned from history. He swallowed the image, but it remained lodged in his chest like a shard of glass. The first reports came 2 days later. A listening post in the Karsus Reach went silent. A Vox relay tower in the north failed to respond to pings. Then came a garbled signal, shrieks over static, a voice screaming, "They're through," before it cut to nothing. The map in the Strategium bloomed with new red icons, unidentified incursions along the western flank, close to the very sectors Harrick intended to strip. Vaughn stared at the map, then at Harrick. "You see it now? The Eye is stirring. Pull those orders back before we doom ourselves." Harrick's jaw tightened. "Number, the Crusade fleet has already moved. Our duty is to adapt." Vale stepped forward, his voice low but carrying. "Your duty is to Cadia. Or has terror blinded you so much you'd hand the planet over gift-wrapped?" The nearest commissar's hand dropped to his sidearm. "Mind your tongue, civilian." Vale didn't flinch. "I'm speaking the truth you all see and are too afraid to say." Vaughn could feel the room's tension coiling, like a wire about to snap. That night, in the dim light of the ramparts, Vale returned to press the point. "You've seen Harrick's answer," he said. "The orders won't change. If you wait for permission, Cadia will burn before you lift a finger." Vaughn's voice was heavy. "You're asking me to break my oath." "I'm asking you to remember why you took it," Vale replied. "Not for terror, for here, for the Khazars, for the children who don't even know what the Eye is yet." Below them, the Manufactoria roared, turning night into a haze of steam and sparks. Vaughn thought of the men and women inside, building weapons they might not live to see used. He thought of the silence from the Karsus Reach. 3 days later, the breach came. A massive warp surge rolled out from the Eye, visible even in daylight, a great rift of light tearing the horizon, vomiting forth jagged silhouettes of ships and things no human tongue could name. Vox traffic exploded with calls for reinforcement. The western flank was already folding. In the chaos, Vaughn ordered the 19th and 27th to hold their lines, ignoring Harrick's deployment schedule. His voice did not waver, though he knew exactly what that meant. Within hours, Harrick summoned him. "You countermanded my orders," Harrick said coldly. "I followed Cadia's need," Vaughn answered. The General Primus's eyes were like steel. You realize the punishment. I realize the alternative, Vorna said, and I will not be the Castellan who let Cadia fall for another war halfway across the galaxy. For a heartbeat, Herrick said nothing. Then he gestured to the commissars. Take him into custody. Vale was faster. He stepped between Vaughn and the commissars, voice sharp. Touch him, and the Kazas will know you've just arrested the man still willing to defend them. The commissars hesitated. Even Herrick felt it. The weight of the choice. The awareness that half the officers might side with Vaughn if pressed. A tremor shook the bastion. Distant artillery, or something worse. Outside, the Eye's storm screamed across the sky. For the first time, the enemy was not the only danger threatening to break Cadia. The sky above Cadia had changed. The familiar star-pricked void was gone, replaced by a bleeding aurora of warp light that crawled like oil across the firmament. From the walls of Castra Mirak, soldiers stared upward in silence, their expressions lit in the sickly green of the Eye's storm. The enemy was no longer a rumor on the horizon. In the western void, great silhouettes prowled the darkness, jagged, wrong-angled ships that seemed to move even when still. Vox reports spoke of strike teams slipping through the cracks in the defense grid, of settlements burning in the night without warning. Inside Cadia's command bastion, the air was thick with heat, static, and unspoken decisions. Jar the arrest that never was. Herrick stood at the center of the strategium, jaw clenched. His commissars flanked him, pistols holstered but hands resting on the grips. Vorna stood opposite, Vale at his shoulder. Between them, the hololithic map flickered with angry red blooms where the western line had already begun to buckle. You've disobeyed a direct order from the Lord Castellan of Cadia's supreme commander, Herrick said, his voice cold but steady. I should have you shot where you stand. You'd waste the Castellan while the Eye's armies march, Vale said, his tone more challenge than question. This is not your counsel, agitator, Herrick snapped. You are here at my forbearance, nothing more. Vale stepped closer, unblinking. Your forbearance doesn't matter when the Khazars starve or burn. Right now, half the western Khazars are looking to Vaughn, not you. You know it. The nearest commissar's hand twitched. One more word and... Stand down, Herrick said sharply, but not to Vale. The command was for the commissars, and it carried the faintest thread of unease. Vaughn spoke finally, his voice calm, but edged with iron. General Primus, the regiments will not march for Argolis. Not now. Not while the Eye vomits its armies onto our soil. That decision is not yours to make, Herrick said. Then make it yours, Vaughn replied, meeting his gaze, before Cadia dies. Fracture lines. That night, the orders went out, 2 sets of them. From Herrick, the 19th, 27th, and 43rd shock troops were to begin immediate embarkation for the Argolis Crusade staging fleet. From Vaughn, all regiments were to dig in and fortify the western line. Any commander abandoning position without relief was to be considered derelict. Within hours, confusion turned to choice. Vox operators reported regimental command channels going silent, switching to encrypted frequencies. Officers convened emergency councils in dim-lit bunkers. At Casa Vera, Colonel Valen declared for Herrick, ordering his men to the transports. At Casa Druvek, Colonel Joran doubled his defensive lines and swore fealty to Vaughn. In the Manufactoria districts, whispers passed between workers, that the High Command was split, that Cadia's fate now hinged on which banners the Cassars chose to follow. The first break. The moment of rupture came at dawn. The 27th Shock Troops, assembled on the parade ground for embarkation, found themselves confronted by the 32nd, rifles shouldered, blocking the road to the spaceport. Major Sarek of the 27th strode forward. "We have orders from the General Primus himself. Step aside." Captain Dravik of the 32nd didn't move. "You have orders from Terra to abandon Cadia. We have orders from Cadia to hold." Tension hung in the air like frost. Every man on both sides had trained together, fought together, shared rations and blood. Now their weapons were leveled at one another. A single last shot cracked. It was impossible to say from which side it came. The standoff dissolved into chaos. Soldiers scattered, some firing in panic, others shouting for ceasefire. In the confusion, 2 troopers lay dead, and the 27th withdrew, their embarkation aborted. The news spread across Cadia like fire in dry grass. Cadians were fighting Cadians. Harek moves. By nightfall, Harek had declared Vaughn's orders treason against the Emperor's will. Vaughn, in turn, issued a declaration that any order weakening Cadia's walls in the face of invasion was void in spirit and in law. Vale walked into Vaughn's quarters as the Castellan stood over a table map, scattered with hastily updated unit markers. "This is it," Vale said quietly. "The choice has been made. The casters will follow you, or they'll follow Harek. There's no middle ground left." Vaughn's face was pale in the low light. "And if they follow Harek, then we lose before the eye even reaches the gates," Vale said flatly. The siege, without and within. The next week was a blur of skirmishes and political maneuvers. Chaos warbands tested the western defences, probing for weakness. In some sectors, Terra-loyal regiments refused to reinforce Cadia first positions, citing conflicting orders. In others, Cadia first commanders diverted munitions from Harek's storehouses without authorization. The Manufactoria began producing ammunition directly for Vaughn's loyalists, bypassing central requisition entirely. Harek responded by ordering arrests. Some carried out, others resisted by armed militia. The war outside was being matched, blow for blow, by the war within. The line in the ash. The breaking point came at Castamardrek, a fortress city guarding one of the last major approach corridors from the Western Void. Chaos forces had been pressing there for days, their assaults growing bolder. Vaughn arrived with a column of reinforcements, the 14th, 32nd, and 55th shock troops, only to find Harek already present, his banner raised above the Khazar's keep. "You will withdraw your forces," Harek said, the moment Vaughn entered the command hall. "This sector is under my command." "You're weeks late," Vaughn answered. "We've been holding this line without relief." "I will not have you undermining my authority," Harek snapped. "Your men are to be reassigned to the Argolis fleet. The Khazar will be held by Terra-loyal forces." Vale's voice cut in like a blade. "There are no Terra-loyal forces here. There are only Cadians. And right now, half the Khazar's garrison is ready to follow Vaughn's orders, not yours." Harek's eyes narrowed. "Then they are traitors." The room erupted, officers shouting, aides rushing between them, commissars reaching for sidearms. Outside, artillery boomed as chaos pushed another assault. In the chaos, a single truth crystallized. The shield of Cadia was no longer whole, and the enemy could see the crack. The choice. As night fell over Castamardrek, Vaughn stood on the wall, looking west. The horizon was ablaze with the unnatural colors of the warp storm. The air smelled of ozone and blood. Vale joined him. "Tomorrow, Harek will call you an outright usurper. Maybe even have proof forged. He's not going to back down." "I know," Vorn said. So what's it going to be? Do we let him take command, or do we take Cadia out of his hands before it's too late? Avon didn't answer at first. The distant shapes of chaos siege engines moved in the stormlight, massive and slow, like predators circling a wounded prey. When he spoke, his voice was low but certain. If Harrick will not defend Cadia, then I will, no matter the cost. The shattering. By dawn, the casters had chosen their sides. Some banners flew the double-headed Aquila of Terror, others the black and silver sigil of the Castellan's Cadia First Command. Vox networks split entirely. Coordinated defense became impossible. When the next chaos assault came, they found a world at war with itself, and they struck like the knife of a patient assassin, sliding neatly into the wound. The shield worlds were shattering, and in the heart of the storm, two men who should have stood together now stood opposed, each claiming to be Cadia's last true defender. The sky above Cadia was no longer a sky. It had become a wound. The eye of terror bled across the heavens, a roaring ocean of unreality spilling its madness into the void. Tendrils of warp light writhed and curled like the feelers of some immense abyssal predator, brushing against the edges of real space and setting every nerve on Cadia's surface alight. On the western front, the first full-scale chaos assault in weeks slammed into the Casa walls with a violence that rattled stone and soul alike. The defenders held, but the air was thick with screams, the stench of promethium, and the metallic tang of blood. Lord Castellan Vorn was in the field this time, standing in the command trench with his boots in the mud and the roar of lass fire in his ears. He had wanted to see it, feel it, to remember why the Cadian shock troops endured centuries of vigilance. The enemy came in waves. First, the cultist rabble, screaming praises to gods Vorn refused to name, their bodies torn apart by disciplined volleys. Then the armored brutes, twisted parodies of space marines, smashing through barricades and forcing squads into brutal close-quarter melees. The 22nd Kasrkin counterattacked, their hellguns flashing like stars in the smoke. It was war as Cadia had always known it. And yet, as the battle raged, Vox reports began to reach Vorn of something wrong in the rear lines. By the time he returned to Eastern Command, the situation had become a political battlefield more dangerous than the one he had left. General Primus Harrick was waiting in the strategium, flanked by his crimson-sashed officers. The air between them was already thick with accusation before a word was spoken. You abandoned your post on the Eastern Bastion to throw yourself into the Western Front without authorization, Harrick began. His voice was measured, but the strain in it was unmistakable. I was commanding in the field, Vorn replied, his tone like a blade drawn from its sheath. Perhaps you should try it sometime instead of sending regiments halfway across the segmentum to die in campaigns that do nothing for Cadia. Harrick's eyes narrowed. Cadia is the Imperium. Its survival depends on the survival of the Imperium entire. We cannot hoard our forces like a fortress hoarder counting coins while the rest of the realm burns. Vorn stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Harrick could hear. And we cannot save the Imperium if Cadia falls. If this falls, the two men stood locked in silent defiance for several heartbeats. Around them, aides and officers watched, tense and motionless. It was Vale who broke the moment. Emerging from the far shadows of the chamber, he moved as if the argument were a play he had been enjoying. My lords, he said lightly, it would be regrettable if such disagreements reached the ears of those who might mistake strategic debate for division. Vorn shot him a warning glance, but Vale ignored it, turning toward Harrick with an expression of calculated neutrality. I believe the men need a symbol now, Vale continued. Something to remind them that Cadia stands united, no matter what storms rage above us. Harrick's jaw tightened. And what symbol do you propose, Captain Vale? A joint command tour, Vale said smoothly. The two of you, side by side, visiting the casters. Let the men see you together. Let them believe the banner is unbroken. Vaughn almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You want me to play the loyal servant for the cameras, while our defenses are stripped bare. Vale's eyes were calm. I want you to give the people hope, because hope is what keeps them fighting, until the time comes when they must fight for something more. Harrick agreed before Vaughn could object. It will be done, tomorrow. The joint tour was a parade in all but name. In Casa Myrak, the soldiers stood in neat ranks as Vaughn and Harrick passed, saluting the two figures they had been told still stood united. Banners rippled in the cold wind, laser gun barrels gleamed in the pale daylight, and the speeches were delivered with all the hollow vigor of men speaking lines written for them. But Vaughn could feel it, the undercurrent, the slight hesitation before some squads saluted Harrick, the faint murmur when his own name was spoken, the way Vale lingered at the edges, speaking in low tones to officers when he thought no one was listening. In Casa Joran, a supply officer bent close to Vaughn during the inspection and whispered, "If you give the word, my lord, the 18th will hold for you alone." Vaughn didn't answer. In Casa Derek, a young lieutenant of the reserves slipped him a folded scrap of parchment, a list of names, officers ready to declare their loyalty should the split come. Still, Vaughn said nothing, but he saw Vale watching him each time, as if measuring the weight of silence. The last stop of the tour was the northern gun line, a sprawling complex of artillery bastions overlooking the approach from the wastes. It was here the illusion shattered. As Harrick gave his closing address to the assembled gunners, a distant explosion shook the air. Not from the warp storm, not from enemy fire, from within the gun line itself, a munitions depot reduced to fire and ruin. Alarms screamed, troops scrambled, reports crackled over the Vox. Sabotage, internal detonations, loyalist troops firing on suspected traitors inside the walls. Vaughn saw Harrick freeze for half a heartbeat, his voice faltering before the shouting swallowed it entirely. And in that instant, he knew the fracture was no longer a crack, it was a break. Vale appeared at his side, the firelight dancing in his eyes. "The banner is already broken, my lord," he said softly. "The only question now is whose banner replaces it." Vaughn looked at the burning depot, at the gunners turning their weapons inward rather than outward. He thought of the lists of names, the whispered promises, the soldiers already choosing sides, and for the first time, he felt the decision hardening in his chest like steel cooling in a forge. If Cadia was to stand, it would not be under the flag Harrick carried. The sky above howled with the voice of the warp, and beneath it, men began to aim their guns at each other. The Cadian dawn came not with light, but with fire. Across the horizon, the black silhouettes of cassers were outlined by the searing glow of distant detonations. The Western Trench network had collapsed during the night. Vox traffic from that sector had gone from panicked to silent in under an hour. Lord Castellan Alaric Vaughan stood over the central tactical display, eyes fixed on the hollowed-out sector markers that now represented absence. Absence of walls, absence of men. Reports came in like a slow bleed. Castraven, overrun. Castteller, abandoned. Surviving units retreating toward the eastern bastion in fragmented, leaderless columns. Beside him, Vale's voice was low but cutting. They're moving faster than our predictions. Harrick will have to commit the reserves now. Vaughn's hands rested on the edge of the display table. Harrick won't send them here, he said. He'll try to hold the inner casters, not the outer wall. Vale studied him for a long moment. Then, the eastern bastion will be left to die. By midday, the first of the retreating regiments staggered into the eastern sector, mud-caked, limping, their formation broken. Some carried wounded. Others had no weapons left at all. The corridors of the bastion filled with the smell of blood and promethium. Sergeant Myra Holden of the 19th Shock Troop saluted Vaughn with a trembling hand. "Sir, they came through the walls. The air turned to glass. She faltered, then swallowed. We held until there was nothing left to hold." Vaughn clasped her forearm. "You'll hold again. Here." Her eyes didn't match his words. The fractures in Cadia's command widened with every hour. Colonel Thade Joran argued for sealing the eastern bastion and refusing any further reinforcements to Harrick's sectors. "He's already written us off," Joran growled in the War Council. "Why bleed for him while he hoards the reserves?" The crimson-sashed envoys from Harrick's command were equally blunt. "You will follow orders or be relieved," one snapped. "The Imperium does not tolerate." Vale's hand went to the hilt of his blade, but Vaughn's glance stopped him. "This is not the moment for threats," Vaughn said. "If we turn on each other now, the enemy will do the rest for us." But even as he said it, he could feel the center slipping. That night, the Eye of Terror loomed huge and hideous over Cadia's sky, bleeding warp light across the shattered lines. From the ramparts, Vaughn could see distant flashes, lance strikes from orbiting ships, counter-barrages from the planet's surface. Somewhere out there, the first Chaos war engines were grinding their way toward them. Vale joined him in silence, the two men watching the death of the horizon together. "They'll be here by dawn," Vale finally said. "And when they come, no help will arrive from Harrick." Vaughn didn't reply. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth in it. The first assault came with the sunrise, a black wave of infantry surging through the shell craters, backed by towering silhouettes wreathed in fire and metal screams. The eastern bastion's guns roared in reply, shaking the walls. Lehman Russ tanks from the 19th rolled forward, their barrels vomiting flame and death into the tide. Heavy bolters stitched red ruin through the charging enemy. For hours they held, but when the first Chaos Defiler breached the wire, the defense became a slaughter. Vaughn moved between firing lines, barking orders, dragging the wounded clear, rallying broken squads. Once he found himself face to face with a creature of twisted brass and flesh, its eyes burning with an alien hunger. He drove his power sword through its chest, felt it shudder, then collapse in a stink of ozone and ash. By the time night fell again, the eastern bastion still stood, but barely. Sections of the outer wall were gone, replaced with makeshift barricades of rubble and wreckage. Ammunition stocks had been halved. The wounded outnumbered the fit. In the command chamber, the situation map was a sea of red. Joran leaned over the table, his voice hoarse. "If we don't break with Harrick now, we'll all be dead before week's end." Vale said nothing, but his gaze locked with Vaughn's. A silent agreement passed between them, not yet spoken, but inevitable. That night, Vaughn couldn't sleep. He walked the ramparts alone, listening to the wind howl through the shattered walls. Somewhere out there, The enemy regrouped. Somewhere deeper still, Harek sat in a fortified casa, deciding whether Cadia's east was worth saving. And for the first time, Vaughn felt the weight of the choice not as a question of loyalty, but of survival. The next dawn would not bring light, only the breaking of what remained. The dawn broke not with hope, but with thunder. From the shattered battlements of Castor Merak, the sky bled red with warp fire as the Chaos Legions hurled themselves against the last lines of the Cadian defense. The ground beneath the fortress trembled with the footfalls of demons, and the air was thick with the acrid smoke of promethium and burnt flesh. Within the command chambers, the air was no less charged. Alaric Vaughn stood at the center of a storm more fierce than any outside. The strategium was divided, his loyal officers huddled in whispered councils on one side, while Harek's crimson-sashed commanders claimed the other. The tension was a tangible thing, coiling in the cramped room like a living beast. Harek's voice cut through the silence, cold and unyielding. "Castellan Vaughn, your insubordination has forced my hand. By imperial decree, you are relieved of command and subject to trial for treason." Vaughn's gaze did not waver. "And yet here we stand, with the enemy at our gates. Tell me, General Primus, has your loyalty saved a single casa today?" Harek's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the walls shook violently. The enemy had breached the outer perimeter once more. It was Vale who moved first. Drawing his blade with a whispering hiss, he stepped beside Vaughn. "Words are for courtiers and nobles. Now is the time for action." Outside, the battle had turned into a brutal melee. The walls were streaked with fire and blood. Cadian defenders fought with desperation, born of knowing this could be their last day. Vaughn led a squad through the breach, cutting down twisted cultists and demonic entities alike. Every movement was a calculation, a delicate balance of fury and discipline. The weight of centuries of duty pressed upon him, yet it was the fractures in his own command that gnawed deeper. He found Sergeant Holden, pale and bloodied, rallying a dwindling squad near the collapsed gate. "Sir, we're losing ground fast. Without reinforcements." "Then we make our own reinforcements," Vaughn snapped. "Tell every loyal unit to hold to my command, regardless of orders from Harek." Holden's eyes burned with fierce determination. "Understood, my lord." Back in the strategium, Harek's officers debated fiercely. Some argued for a negotiated ceasefire with Vaughn to present a united front. Others called for immediate suppression of the rebellious faction. Harek's voice brooked no argument. "There is no ceasefire with traitors. The Emperor's justice will be swift." The first loyalist squads were dispatched to seize Vaughn's command bunkers, but news came quickly. Several key casas had declared allegiance to Vaughn, and reinforcements intended for Harek's forces were being intercepted or turned aside. In the streets and tunnels beneath the fortress, Cadian soldier fought Cadian soldier. Loyalty was no longer a simple matter of orders, but of conviction and survival. Vale moved like a shadow among the chaos, delivering strategic commands with ruthless precision. "The western wall holds as long as you hold together," he told the officers he rallied. "Divide, and you die." Vaughn knew that every decision now carved deeper wounds into the fabric of Cadia. In the grim light of an underground command post, he met with Colonel Joran and several others who had sworn loyalty to his cause. "We must secure the Manufactoria," Joran said. "Without weapons and ammo, our defense will collapse." "And the Vox grids," added another officer. "Harek's men control the transmissions. We must cut their voice to the Cassers, or lose the battle of morale. Vaughan nodded. Prepare the teams. We move at first light. The night was punctuated by the distant screams of artillery and the closer crackle of bolter fire. Through the haze, Vaughan's thoughts drifted to the wider war. The Argolis crusade fleet had sailed without Cadia's strength. The Imperium's attention was elsewhere. And here, on this dying world, brothers turned against brothers. Immortality, Vaughan reflected bitterly, was a curse no less cruel than the warp storms that surrounded them. To live through millennia, only to watch the very foundations of your world crumble from within. At dawn, the assault on the Manufactoria began. Vaughan led the charge, supported by Vale's tactical teams. The battle was brutal and chaotic. Sabotage, hand-to-hand combat, and frantic firefights in narrow corridors. Several times, Vaughan found himself face to face with men he once called brothers, now enemies by decree. The weight of betrayal was suffocating. Vale's voice came through the Vox comm. The Vox grid is ours, broadcasting now. Cadians, stand with your true Castellan. The Emperor's justice is in your hands. From the battlements, soldiers hesitated, some lowering their weapons, others firing into the darkness. The tide began to turn, but at a terrible cost. The Manufactoria were damaged. Fires smoldered where machinery had been sabotaged. Casualties mounted. Vaughan stood amid the ruin, his armor scorched and dented. He looked to Vale, who offered a grim nod. We hold, but for how long? The question hung in the air, like the dying light of a fading star. Cadia was a fortress fractured, its defenders torn between loyalty and survival. Outside, the eye roared, eager to consume the broken shield. Within, the last bonds of unity shattered beneath the weight of ambition, fear, and the unbearable cost of immortality. The blood-red sky wept fire over Cadia, a dying world consumed by war's ceaseless flame. From the shattered ramparts of Casa Mirak, the last bastion still holding, the war-weary soldiers gazed into the abyss, their souls as frayed as the tattered banners snapping in the wind. Lord Castellan Vaughan paced through the dimly lit command hall, the weight of countless choices etched into his face. Each decision had carved deeper wounds into the fortress and the hearts of its defenders. The war outside was no longer just against the enemies of the Imperium. It was a war within, between brothers divided by loyalty and desperation. Vale stood by the war table, his sharp eyes scanning the flickering holomap, where red dots marked enemy movements, and blue the remaining loyal forces. Our numbers dwindle. The western gun line is lost. The Manufactoria burns, and the troops grow weary. Vaughan closed his eyes briefly. We have become shadows, fighting to hold on to the memory of a shield that no longer exists. The Council of War gathered, a mix of battle-worn officers and grim-faced strategists. Some bore scars not only of battle, but of fractured allegiances. Among them, Colonel Joran's voice rose, firm but laced with exhaustion. We cannot afford another division. The men need purpose, not faction. Harrick's loyalists sat stiffly, their crimson sashes a stark contrast against the darkening room. Commissar Tarvek's gaze met Vaughan's with thinly veiled contempt. The Castellan has fractured the chain of command. We fight for the Imperium, not personal ambition. Vaughan's jaw tightened. Imperium? What good is it if the shield is shattered? If Cadia falls, the Imperium will bleed with it. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. Outside, the chaos worsened. Saboteurs struck from within. Cadian soldiers turned traitors or spies. Explosions rocked vital supply lines. Communications were hijacked. Trust became a rare currency. The once solid ranks of the shock troops fragmented, their unity corroded by fear and betrayal. Vale moved like a spectre through the war-torn corridors, coordinating countermeasures, his voice a steady beacon amid the chaos. We cannot afford fractures in our defense. Every man must know the stakes. This is survival. But even survival demanded sacrifice. That night, Vaughn received word that the Eastern Supply Depot, the last major source of munitions, had been overrun. The Chaos hordes clawed through the outer walls with relentless fury, while the inner defenses strained to hold. Vaughn summoned his trusted officers, the shadows of fatigue darkening their faces. "We must hold the bastion, whatever the cost," he declared. "Prepare for a counterattack at first light." The dawn attack was brutal. Amid the crumbling walls and burning ruins, Vaughn led a desperate sortie. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of promethium, and the metallic tang of blood. Bolters cracked, chainswords roared, and the screams of the dying echoed through the shattered halls. Vaughn fought with the ferocity of a man who knew each breath might be his last. Beside him, Vale's precise commands rallied scattered squads, turning chaos into coordinated fury. But victory came at a high price. The eastern bastion's walls were breached in several sectors, and casualties mounted. Loyalists and traitors alike fell beneath the ceaseless onslaught. In the aftermath, Vaughn stood amid the ruins, his armor scorched and battered. The faces of fallen comrades haunted his mind, their sacrifices a heavy debt. Vale approached quietly. "We can't hold much longer." Vaughn's voice was grim but resolute. "Then we make the final stand." The final stand was not just a battle of weapons, but of wills. The fractures within Cadia's command threatened to collapse the last defenses. Whispers of surrender and betrayal grew louder as exhaustion and despair took root. Yet amid the ruin, a flicker of hope remained. In the courage of the few who chose to stand, in the unyielding spirit of those who refused to let the shield fall without a fight. Vaughn's internal struggle deepened. He wrestled with the burden of leadership, the cost of immortality, and the bitter irony of watching an empire built on loyalty crumble beneath his feet. The war outside was mirrored by the war within, each choice a blade cutting deeper into his soul. As the chapter closes, the storm rages on, the outcome uncertain. The shattered shield of Cadia trembles on the edge of oblivion, its fate resting in the hearts of those brave enough to fight and those broken enough to betray. The heart of Cadia pulsed with desperation. Beneath the broken towers and shattered ramparts, the air was thick with whispered fears and silent accusations. Trust, once the bedrock of the fortress, had become a brittle thread stretched taut, ready to snap. In the dim glow of the command chamber, Castellan Vaughn stared down the flickering holomap, his hands clenched at his sides. Every pulse of light on that map was a heartbeat in the dying body of the fortress, a life hanging by a thread. Vale approached, his voice low and measured. The betrayals deepen. Several officers suspected of collusion with Harrick's faction have been uncovered. There is talk of a traitor among the inner circle. Vaughn's eyes darkened. A poison within the heart of our defense is worse than the enemy at the gates. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of secret meetings in the shadowed halls, voices overheard in the dead of night, shadowed figures slipping through the warrens of Cadia with unseen agendas. Vaughn summoned his most trusted, Sergeant Holden, Colonel Joran, and a handful of loyal officers. Their faces were grim, lines etched by sleepless nights and the weight of impossible choices. "We stand on the edge of ruin," Vaughan said. "And yet our greatest threat may not be the chaos hordes outside, but the darkness within." That night, an assassination attempt shattered the fragile calm. A blade plunged into the darkness of the command chamber, narrowly missing Vaughan as he stood conferring with his officers. The attacker vanished into the labyrinthine corridors, leaving behind a trail of blood and suspicion. Vale's voice was grim. "The web tightens. We must find the traitor before this fortress falls from within." The hunt began. Every shadow was suspect, every whispered conversation a potential betrayal. Paranoia gripped the defenders like a suffocating shroud. In the barracks, soldiers eyed each other with mistrust. Bonds forged in battle frayed under the weight of suspicion. Vaughan's internal turmoil deepened. The faces of comrades who might turn against him haunted his thoughts. The cost of immortality revealed in the endless cycle of trust and betrayal, hope and despair. He questioned the nature of loyalty. Was it born of conviction or convenience? Was it stronger than fear, or did fear corrode it to nothing? Amidst the chaos, a whispered revelation emerged. Colonel Joran brought word of a secret alliance between Harrick's faction and a cult of the dark gods, an unholy pact to betray Cadia from within in exchange for power and favor. The implications were devastating. Vaughan convened a council of war. The stakes were clear: uncover the traitors, sever the rot, and unite what remained of Cadia's defenders before the enemy shattered them all. But the battle was no longer just for the fortress. It was for the soul of Cadia itself. As the chapter closes, the fortress stands on the brink, a shattered jewel reflecting the fractured loyalties of those sworn to protect it. The war within is as lethal as the war without, and the shadows grow ever longer. The last light of Cadia flickered like a dying ember against the vast void. The sky bled with warp taint, the Eye of Terror's monstrous silhouette, casting its malevolent shadow over the battered fortress world. Every breath was heavy with smoke, every heartbeat a reminder of the inexorable march toward oblivion. Within the shattered walls of Casa Myrak, the air was thick with tension. The War Council convened amid ruined stone and flickering hollow emitters. Faces once familiar were now lined with suspicion and grief, their eyes haunted by the weight of betrayal. Lord Castellan Vaughan stood at the head of the council, his expression grave but resolute. The war had changed them all. Comrades turned enemies. Hope dulled to a faint glimmer beneath layers of despair. "Time grows thin," Vaughan began, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Harrick's traitors move openly now. We have lost men, munitions, and ground because of their treachery. The fortress will not hold if this rot is not purged." Vale stepped forward, his gaze sharp as a blade. "The enemy will launch their final assault soon. We must be ready. Our lines must hold, or Cadia is lost." The council fell silent, the weight of inevitability settling like a shroud. In the midst of this, an urgent report shattered the fragile calm. Harrick's forces were consolidating, preparing for a massive strike aimed directly at the eastern bastion, the final blow to break what little remained of Cadia's defenses. Vaughan's jaw tightened. "Then we meet them here. The bastion will be our grave or our shield." Preparations began with grim determination. The Loyalists fortified barricades, patched crumbling walls, and mustered every available fighter. Every soldier, every last bullet became sacred. Yet beneath the surface, fractures widened. Some officers questioned Vaughn's authority, whispering doubts that poisoned morale. The betrayal's shadow deepened as the enemy prepared to strike. That night, Vaughn walked the ramparts alone. The wind carried the distant roar of battle and the faint echoes of lost voices. Fallen comrades, ghosts of a better time. Immortality had become a curse. To live through endless war, to witness the fall of everything held dear. The burden weighed heavier with every moment. As dawn broke, the sky ignited. The final assault descended like a storm of darkness and fire. Chaos engines thundered, lashing the walls with infernal fury. Demons poured through breaches, their howls a symphony of despair. The defenders fought with desperate valor. Vaughn stood at the forefront, rallying his shattered troops, his blade a beacon in the chaos. Vale's voice cut through the din. "Hold the line for Cadia, for the Emperor." The battle was apocalyptic. Walls crumbled, blood flowed like rivers, and the air was thick with smoke and screams. Brothers fell beside brothers, some betraying others in moments of panic and fear. Vaughn faced a traitor officer in the heat of battle, a man who once fought at his side. The clash was fierce and bitter, steel against steel, loyalty against despair. In the end, Vaughn's blade found its mark, but the victory tasted like ash. As the sun set on the devastated bastion, only a handful of defenders remained. The fortress was a ruin, the shield broken. Vaughn looked to the horizon, the eye of terror still bleeding light into the void. The cost had been unimaginable. The empire of Cadia shattered by war without and within. The chapter closes on a note of tragic reflection. The fall of a shield, the fracture of loyalty, and the price of immortality. The blood-streaked skies above Cadia burned with the dying fires of a world on the edge of oblivion. The shattered bastion lay in ruins beneath a thunderous sky where the very air seemed heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 fallen souls. The once proud fortress, heart of the Imperium's bulwark, now echoed with the hollow silence of defeat and despair. Lord Castellan Vaughn stood atop the highest ruined tower, the wind tearing at his tattered cloak. His eyes, ancient and weary, scanned the horizon where the eye of terror's swirling chaos bled into the cosmos. Every breath carried the weight of centuries, the curse of immortality, watching empire after empire crumble beneath his gaze, the endless cycle of war and ruin unbroken. But now, in these final hours, the greatest battle of his long existence was at hand. The enemy's assault was relentless. Demonic engines tore through the fractured walls like jagged claws of destruction. Waves of corrupted soldiers and twisted cultists poured through the breaches, a living tide of madness and death. Within the ruined halls, loyalists fought to hold the line. Among them was Vale, his blade flashing like lightning, cutting down any who dared breach their last refuge. Beside him, Sergeant Holden's voice rang out, a rallying cry amidst the chaos. Vaughn's heart ached with every loss, each fallen brother a wound deeper than any blade. Yet he held firm, bound by duty and the fading memory of what Cadia once was. The War Council had fractured beyond repair, but here, in the crucible of battle, those who remained fought as one. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming, yet Cadia's defenders embodied the very soul of resistance. Vaughn found himself face to face with General Primus Harrick. The two men regarded each other with cold fury. Former allies turned bitter enemies by betrayal and the harsh tides of war. Harrick's voice was a harsh rasp. Your defiance ends here, Castellan. Cadia's fall is inevitable. Surrender and spare what remains. Vaughn's eyes burned with quiet fire. I will never surrender what the Emperor entrusted to me. Even in death, Cadia stands. Steel clashed as they engaged, a battle not just of weapons, but of wills and broken loyalties. Every strike echoed with the weight of history and shattered oaths. The duel raged through the ruins, until at last, Vaughn's blade found its mark. Harrick fell, his last breath a curse and a plea for mercy denied. But the victory was hollow. The bastion crumbled around them, the enemy pressing in from all sides. In the final moments, Vaughn gathered the remaining survivors. His voice was steady, though his heart trembled beneath the armor. We stand on the edge of oblivion, but in our defiance we are immortal. Let the Emperor's light guide our final stand. They formed ranks, bolters raised, hearts steeled against the coming storm. The last battle was a symphony of fire and fury. Bolter fire illuminated the darkness, chainsword screamed, and the roar of demons filled the air. Sacrifice and valor entwined in a desperate dance. Vaughn fought with the fury of centuries, each strike a testament to the enduring spirit of Cadia. Around him, brothers fell, their lives a beacon against the gathering night. As the bastion fell, Vaughn stood amidst the ruin, the last guardian of a fallen shield. The eye of terror loomed above, a storm of darkness and despair. But in the heart of destruction, a flicker of defiance remained. The oath of a Castellan, the legacy of a world that stood until it did not. The shattered ruins of Castor Murac lay smothered in a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant howls of warp winds and the occasional crackle of dying Promethean fires. The sky was a pallid grey, stained with the remnants of chaos and ruin, an eternal twilight hovering over a world that had seen its final dawn. Lord Castellan Vaughn moved slowly through the rubble, each step weighted with the gravity of loss. His armor bore the scars of 1,000 battles, but none deeper than those carved into his soul. Around him, the remnants of Cadia's once mighty forces gathered, survivors hollow-eyed, clutching relics of a glory now vanished. The bitter taste of defeat clung to the air. The war council was no more. In its place stood a fractured assembly of broken men and women, their faces etched with grief and exhaustion. Vale remained at Vaughn's side, the once sharp strategist now tempered by sorrow and the harsh lessons of war. Vaughn's voice, usually commanding and steady, was now quieter, reflective. Cadia's shield has shattered. The empire we defended lies in ruin. But in this end, there is a truth, that sacrifice is the price of survival. Survivors recounted tales of heroism and treachery. Some spoke of comrades who had turned on each other, driven by fear or ambition. Others whispered of those who gave their lives, so others might live, embodying the spirit of Cadia to the last breath. The weight of immortality pressed heavily on Vaughn's mind. To live through the endless cycle of war was to witness endless loss, an unbroken chain of rising and falling empires. His curse was to remember every fallen brother, every broken oath. A message crackled through the vox, a faint glimmer of hope amid despair. Reinforcements from the wider Imperium had arrived, though too late to save Cadia. Their presence was a balm to battered souls. Vale looked to Vaughn, a flicker of determination returning to his eyes. The fight continues, Castellan. even in ruin, we endure. Vaughan turned to the survivors, his gaze steady despite the sorrow. We are the last shield of Cadia. We carry its legacy not as a burden, but as a beacon. The Emperor's light guides us still. The survivors raised their weapons in silent salute, a vow forged in fire and loss. Outside, the Eye of Terror still raged, an eternal storm threatening to consume what remained. But within the hearts of the fallen, a fragile hope flickered, that from ashes a new shield might one day rise. As the chapter closes, the tragic fall of Cadia is tempered by the enduring spirit of those who survive, a bittersweet end reflecting the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The dying sun of Cadia hung low, casting a cold, pale light over the barren wasteland that once was a bastion of the Imperium. The wind whispered through the cracked stones and shattered walls, carrying the faint echoes of battles long past and voices long silenced. Time itself seemed to mourn the fall of a world that had stood unyielding for millennia. Lord Castellan Vaughan stood alone atop the highest peak, gazing out over the ruins, a kingdom of ash and shadow. His armor, once gleaming and proud, was now scarred by fire and war, much like his soul. Immortality, a blessing he once craved, had become a torment. To witness the endless cycle of rise and fall, to bear the memory of countless losses that no mortal could endure. The vastness of the void before him was unbroken, except for the distant, churning mass of the Eye of Terror, a wound in the fabric of reality that had swallowed so much. It pulsed with dark hunger, a reminder that evil never truly dies, only waits. Vaughan's thoughts drifted through the centuries, the founding of Cadia, the glory of the shield, the sacrifices etched into every stone and soul. Yet now, all that remained was ruin and memory. A faint light flickered in the distance, the arrival of reinforcements too late to save the world, but not too late to carry its legacy forward. The burden of immortality lay heavy on Vaughan's shoulders. He was a sentinel bound to watch history repeat itself, a guardian of a legacy doomed to fracture and fall. He questioned the price of eternal life. Was it worth the endless sorrow, the burden of memories no one else could share? Yet within him burned a spark of defiance, a refusal to surrender completely to despair. Vaughan knelt upon the scorched earth, placing his hand on a broken relic, the sigil of Cadia, cracked but unbroken. It was a symbol not just of the fallen empire, but of resilience and hope amid darkness. Though the shield has fallen, he whispered, its light shall guide those who come after. The Emperor's will endures beyond the ruin. Around him, the survivors gathered, weary but unbroken. Their faces bore the marks of loss and determination alike. They were the living memory of Cadia, the last flicker of a shield that once spanned a galaxy. Vale stood at Vaughan's side, his gaze steady. The fight continues, Castellan. Though this chapter ends, the saga is far from over. Vaughan nodded slowly, accepting the truth in those words. The Empire might crumble, heroes might fall, but the flame of resistance would never die. As the final light faded from the sky, Vaughan raised his sword, not as a weapon of war, but as a beacon of hope and remembrance. The dying sun cast long shadows across the ruins, and yet within those shadows, a new dawn waited, uncertain, fragile, but real. The fall of Cadia was the death of an era, but not the end of all things. The cost of immortality was clear, the price steep, But from the ashes of shattered shields and broken oaths, new legends would rise. The galaxy would remember. It must.